Hello, beautiful souls. How are you today? I am coming at you with another Founding Fathers Discovery Series episode. This is episode 5, part 1. It will be a part 2 um, video on Richard Milhouse Nixon. If you're anything like me, I was born in the early 70s, 73. I'm about to have my 51st anniversary. And I didn't know much about President Nixon besides what was flashed through the news, right? And now we know because we are wiser, certainly older and wiser, that pretty much what we're blasted with is what they want us to know and not necessarily the truth. Just because it's in the news, printed in a paper, or a book is written about it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. It's just opinion these days. Journalism has lost its foundation and footing because they've been bought and paid for. So let's get into it. As with all of the Founding Fathers series, what I try to do is give the commonly known information at the beginning and then get into some of the um, other information that I've received via multiple ways. And some of those ways are that the soul that was the being that I'm speaking about steps forward to bring forth some truth to set the record straight. That has happened most of the time. In this case, the soul that uh, was with President Nixon, Richard Nixon, is another sibling soul. And so I was able to just contact them, and they definitely had different answers to my questions. And some of it is downloaded through my clairs, and some of it is just divination, where I get a hit on something, I get an idea, and I ask source and um, go from there. So, without further ado, let's get into it. I was pleasantly surprised most of the information, and I hope that you enjoy it as well. Before I get started, too, I don't commonly remember to ask, but please comment on our videos, ask questions, share. If you don't mind subscribing, um, it's it's difficult to say the least with all the shadow banning. Even some of the subscribers have a hard time finding my video content. They just do a really good job of burying it. So remember that I have YouTube and also Rumble. I try to upload everything that's on YouTube to Rumble as a backup channel. And usually the things that are a little bit more controversial to some live longer there on the Rumble side. So if you don't mind um, smashing that like button, making a comment, and sharing, subscribing, that would be very much appreciated. Okay. Richard Milhouse Nixon. He was born January 9th, 1913, died April 22nd, 1994. He was raised a Quaker and also Methodist in California on a lemon farm until the lemon farm went bankrupt. Political affiliation is Republican, and he was elected the 37th president of the United States from 1969 to 1974. So I was less than one whenever he departed the White House. He was also the 36th vice president under Eisenhower from 1953 to 1961. He had military affiliations with the Naval Reserves, just like JFK, in World War II. And he had lots of exposure and experience with Indochina, Korea, Soviet Union, and many other areas. He was actually very well traveled long before he ever took up the office of the president. Some of the notable events for Richard Nixon. He was the president during the drawdown of the Vietnam presence as far as the U.S. troops are concerned. Apollo 11 moon landing occurred during his presidency. And that essentially, I think for the collective ended the space race, but it never really ended. He established the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and OSHA, Occupational Safety Health Administration. He resigned under Watergate scandal. More on that later. He rose to prominence as an anti-communist lawyer during the Alger Hiss case. Nixon was Eisenhower's running mate and served as vice president to Eisenhower for 8 years. Nixon narrowly lost in 1960 to JFK. He ended the draft in 1973, concluded the anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Soviet Union, pushed for Controlled Substances Act, which later became the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. This was the official start of the war on drugs. Responsible for passing the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Air Act. He initiated and ratified the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. He enforced desegregation of Southern schools. Relations with Native Americans improved while he was president. In 1971, he proposed the federalization of Medicaid and HMOs with vast health insurance reform, calling for increased funding for many health issues. Two of the main were sickle cell crisis and cancer. Now, education. Known as an above average student and a great debater, he was offered a tuition grant to Harvard, which he declined to stay in California. He went to Whittier College and then on to Duke Law on a scholarship. Very good academic scholarship. Post-education, Nixon hoped to join the FBI. He received no response to his application, and Nixon later learned he was hired, but the appointment was canceled suspiciously due to budget cuts. He joined the U.S. Naval Reserves instead and worked his way around various campaigns in the South Pacific and various assignments across the U.S. mainland. Retiring in 1966 from the U.S. Naval Reserves as a commander. Again, this was more of the international exposure that he had, which actually served him very well throughout his lifetime. June 1947, Nixon supported the Taft-Hartley Act, a federal law that monitored the activities and power of labor unions. Nixon served as a member on the Education and Labor Committee. Another notch against him in the world of organized crime. Nixon was always wary of internal communist threats. The Nixon bill, that's M-U, N as in Nicole, D as in dog, T as in Tom, Nixon bill, was to implement a new approach for the complicated problem of internal communist subversion, also known as spying. It provided for registration of all Communist Party members and required a statement of the source of all printed and broadcast material issued by organizations that were found to be communist fronts. The persistence of Nixon on the House Un-American Activities Committee, that's an odd name, right? So the breakdown of it was a committee to mitigate people who seemed to be involved in un-American acts. Helped break the Alger Hiss spy case. Hiss was found to be a Soviet spy embedded. In the Senate, Nixon took a prominent position in opposing global communism. Nixon often criticized Harry Truman over the handling of the Korean War. Nixon supported statehood of Alaska and Hawaii, and Nixon voted in favor of the civil rights for minorities. He supported federal disaster relief for India and Yugoslavia. He voted against price control and against benefits for illegal immigrants. That kind of surprised me that long ago, it was already a debatable topic whether to give benefits to illegal immigrants or not. Dwight Eisenhower left his vice president pick to the Republican National Committee. They chose Nixon based on him being younger. He was 39 years old at the time. He was California based, which gave them access to a huge amount of votes. He had a strong stance on communism and was seen as a major vote getter. Once elected, Eisenhower granted Nixon more responsibilities than any previous vice president. Nixon attended Cabinet and National Security Council meetings, and these new duties increased Nixon's presence in the foreign and domestic affairs. He worked enthusiastically with Eisenhower to accomplish the presidential goals of that administration, and this earned Nixon the title of the first modern vice president based on his actions. During the 6 weeks post-Eisenhower's heart attack, Nixon filled in and led without any attempt to seize power, and this was unheard of prior. There was no 25th Amendment in place at the time, and the vice president had no legal or formal power to act officially. He just stepped in and did it because it was the right thing to do. In 1957, Nixon went to Africa. Upon his return, he helped to shepherd the Civil Rights Act of 1957. He went to Africa. He experienced life from their perspective. He met with many, many tribes and many, many leaders, and came back, and this was on his heart. In 1959, Nixon went to the Soviet Union and toured the opening of the American National Exhibit in Moscow. I did not know they had one. The Soviet First Secretary, Nikita Khrushchev, debated merits of capitalism versus communism with Nixon. In 1960, Nixon campaigned against JFK for President of the United States. JFK called for new blood, claiming Eisenhower and Nixon administration allowed the Soviet Union to overtake the U.S. in quantity and quality of ballistic missiles. In a 0.2% margin of victory, JFK won the election. After a 7-year hiatus, Nixon decided to run again for President of the United States and won the 37th presidential election. Nixon spoke on turning partisan politics into a new age of unity as a peacemaker. I love that. On October 6, 1973, an Arabic coalition led by Egypt and Syria, supported by the arms and supplies by the Soviet Union, attacked an Israel base, and this was called the Yom Kippur War. Ultimately, Nixon took personal responsibility for the airdrop to resupply the Israeli forces. At the time, there was no support to do so, congressional or Senate. This gave them the ordinance to make a stand deep into enemy territory, and this quickly escalated to a superpower crisis. Nixon ordered U.S. military to DEFCON 3, alert for nuclear war, which was the highest possible outcome and the highest DEFCON level since the Cuban Missile Crisis. At that time, the Soviets backed down. However, with Israel's victory largely due to the support and aid given by the United States and Richard Nixon, the Arabic OPEC retaliated by refusing to sell crude oil to the United States. This, in 1973, was the oil crisis, and the embargo caused gas shortages and rationing of fuel in the United States. This eventually was ended by the oil-producing nations, OPEC, as peace in the Middle East took hold. It took several months, years to get to there. After this, Nixon made one of his final international visits to Middle East as president, in June 1974, and became the first president to visit Israel at that time. On July 20th, 1969, Nixon spoke to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin during their moonwalk. Nixon called the conversation the most historic phone call ever made from the White House. At this point, I'm going to say that the soul that was with Nixon during his presidency gave me this bit of information. I asked, what is the truth of the Apollo 11 mission? They landed, just not where the people were told. They saw the nefarious things going on at the moon, and they videotaped it. As soon as they landed back on Earth, NASA confiscated the footage. Astronauts signed a non-disclosure agreement, and NASA hired Hollywood actors and directors to refilm the landing. They didn't want the world remembering that we are not alone. There has been many nefarious things going on at the moon for thousands of years. And that is where we will end part one. Please stay tuned. In a few days, part two will drop, and it gets really good. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you again next time.